The early days of 1968 brought a deceptive stillness to South Vietnam, masking a storm that would soon rewrite history. American military commanders, stationed comfortably in Saigon, possessed profound confidence in their overwhelming firepower and strategic dominance. Did the world's most advanced intelligence apparatus fail, or was the truth simply too impossible for them to believe? General William Westmoreland reviewed the latest field reports, observing that enemy forces appeared severely depleted after years of relentless bombing campaigns. He casually remarked to his aides that the enemy was essentially neutralized, predicting a swift conclusion to the exhausting conflict. Across the nation, citizens were eagerly preparing for the upcoming Lunar New Year, widely known as Tet. A customary holiday ceasefire had been officially announced and mutually agreed upon by both sides, fostering a temporary atmosphere of genuine tranquility. Markets buzzed with ordinary civilians purchasing vibrant decorations and traditional foods for the most important festival of the year. American soldiers relaxed in their barracks, looking forward to a brief respite from the grueling jungle patrols. No one suspected that this negotiated peace was actually a brilliantly orchestrated smokescreen designed to blind the entire Allied military command structure. Meanwhile, deep within the dense forests and along the clandestine supply routes, a massive logistical operation was unfolding in absolute silence. Thousands of guerrilla fighters were systematically moving towards major urban centers, navigating under the cover of darkness. They disguised themselves as ordinary peasants, merchants, or workers returning home to celebrate the holiday with their families. Weapons were carefully dismantled and concealed inside unassuming everyday items to bypass the numerous military checkpoints scattered along the highways. The sheer scale of this covert mobilization remained completely invisible to the sophisticated surveillance aircraft flying continuously overhead. The bustling streets of Saigon were flooded with carts transporting goods for the impending festivities. Beneath the vibrant yellow chrysanthemums flowing into the capital, cold steel was waiting for the midnight hour. Mortar tubes, AK-47 rifles, and deadly explosives were hidden beneath false bottoms of vegetable wagons, or even inside wooden coffins seemingly bound for traditional funeral services. The local police forces casually waved these vehicles through the barricades, entirely oblivious to the lethal cargo they carried. This meticulous infiltration turned the very fabric of civilian life into a deadly Trojan horse against the occupying forces. The American intelligence network was entirely fixated on a remote combat outpost near the demilitarized zone. The intense siege of Khe Sanh had captivated the attention of high-ranking military strategists in Washington and Saigon alike. President Lyndon Johnson demanded daily updates on the situation, obsessively fearing a catastrophic defeat, similar to what the French experienced at Dien Bien Phu. Senior analysts confidently asserted that this isolated mountainous region was the primary target of the communist strategy. They completely failed to realize that the massive artillery barrages raining down on Khe Sanh were merely a spectacular diversionary tactic. In Saigon, an intelligence officer excitedly reported to his superiors about captured documents hinting at a nationwide general uprising. However, these crucial warnings were swiftly dismissed by the upper command echelons as unbelievable propaganda designed to boost enemy morale. A top general scoffed at the intelligence, firmly stating that the opponent lacked the logistical capability to launch such a widespread coordinated assault. This institutional arrogance created a dangerous blind spot, preventing the Allied forces from connecting the scattered dots of troop movements. The illusion of absolute security grew stronger as the holiday approached its peak celebration day. While the military brass drank champagne at diplomatic receptions, specialized commando units were reviewing their targets in cramped safehouses throughout the capital. These highly trained operatives memorized the intricate blueprints of key government buildings and military installations. They checked their weapons one final time, whispering encouraging words to one another in the dimly lit rooms. The commander of a sapper squad reminded his men that their mission required absolute sacrifice, emphasizing that they were the vanguard of a historical revolution. The countdown to 0 hour continued ticking away, completely unnoticed by the joyous crowds outside. South Vietnamese soldiers had been granted extensive leave to return to their home provinces for the traditional celebrations. As a direct result, military bases across the country were severely understaffed and functioning with only a skeletal defensive crew. Commanders assumed that the unwritten rules of the cultural holiday would guarantee a period of complete inactivity on the battlefield. This tragic miscalculation left entire cities virtually unprotected against the impending waves of highly coordinated assaults. The festive fireworks illuminating the night sky would soon be entirely indistinguishable from the brutal flashes of automatic gunfire. Even as sporadic early attacks broke out in some northern and central provinces due to a calendar misinterpretation, the overall American command remained stubbornly complacent. Westmoreland interpreted these premature skirmishes as desperate, uncoordinated actions of a defeated army rather than the opening salvos of a massive offensive. He sternly advised his staff to simply maintain their current defensive postures, assuring them that the situation was entirely under control. The sheer inability to comprehend the enemy's bold paradigm shift proved to be a fatal strategic error that would cost thousands of lives. The final hours of the old year slipped away quietly, accompanied by the traditional sounds of distant firecrackers popping in the streets. Inside the heavily guarded perimeter of the United States Embassy in Saigon, military policemen were struggling to stay awake during their mundane night shift. They shared casual jokes about the humid weather and dreamed of returning to their peaceful hometowns in America. No one noticed a small convoy of inconspicuous vehicles slowly approaching the embassy walls through the deserted avenues of the slumbering city. The greatest deception in modern military history was absolutely flawless. A radio operator at the Central Military Headquarters casually adjusted his headset, expecting another boring transmission about routine patrol movements. Instead, he heard only static interference, completely unaware that communication lines across the countryside were being systematically severed by specialized guerrilla units. The intricate web of communication that bound the massive American military apparatus together was slowly unraveling in the dark. This calculated isolation was a vital component of the master plan, ensuring that defensive reinforcements could not be effectively coordinated once the initial widespread attacks inevitably commenced across the nation. High above the atmosphere, advanced reconnaissance satellites silently orbited the Earth, capturing detailed images of seemingly peaceful Vietnamese cities illuminated by festive streetlights. Human analysts meticulously studied these glowing photographs back in Washington, completely missing the invisible army gathering right under their noses. The technological superiority of the United States military was utterly useless against an enemy that utilized the ancient, unyielding shadows of the jungle and the chaotic vibrancy of crowded urban markets. The impending storm was entirely psychological, preparing to shatter the unshakable confidence of an entire generation of mighty political leaders. In the coastal city of Da Nang, another major military hub, American commanders authorized a grand musical performance for the deployed troops. Thousands of soldiers gathered in a massive open-air theater, laughing loudly and enjoying the rare taste of normal civilian entertainment. They enthusiastically cheered for the performers, momentarily forgetting the harsh realities of the surrounding brutal combat zones. Just a few miles away, disciplined enemy battalions were quietly slipping into their pre-assigned attack formations on the dark outskirts of the city. The stark contrast between this joyful celebration and the impending slaughter was profoundly chilling. As the clock inched closer to the fateful midnight strike, the atmosphere across the divided nation became incredibly tense for those who knew the terrifying secret. Guerrilla fighters nervously checked their synchronized wristwatches, feeling the heavy burden of history resting squarely upon their trembling shoulders. They understood perfectly well that survival was highly unlikely, but their extraordinary dedication to the ideological cause pushed them relentlessly forward. The vibrant festive decorations hanging above the streets would soon bear witness to an unprecedented explosion of violence that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire 20th century. A seasoned combat photographer resting in his Saigon hotel room suddenly felt a strange unease settling heavily in his stomach. He muttered quietly to himself that the unusual silence of the city felt completely unnatural, like the deep breath taken right before a terrible scream. He instinctively double-checked his heavy camera equipment, sensing deeply that he might soon capture the most significant photographs of his entire journalistic career. Meanwhile, ordinary families continued their joyful dinner conversations, completely oblivious to the historical earthquake about to spectacularly shatter their peaceful, fragile reality into a million bloody pieces. At the prominent presidential palace, top political figures of South Vietnam celebrated the promising arrival of the Hwaparist new lunar cycle. They raised their crystal glasses high, cheerfully toasting to the glorious impending defeat of the communist insurgency. The beautifully manicured lawns and towering iron gates of the grand estate seemingly projected an absolute aura of unchallengeable governmental authority. However, heavily armed strike teams were already positioning themselves perfectly within striking distance of those very identical gates. The magnificent palace was secretly marked as the ultimate symbolic prize for the bold attackers, waiting patiently in the shadows. The carefully constructed illusion of an unbreakable peace had successfully paralyzed the mighty Allied defensive mechanisms at every conceivable strategic level. The brilliant deceptive maneuvers executed by the guerrilla leadership transformed the cultural sanctity of the Tet holiday into their most formidable tactical weapon. American generals simply could not fathom that an adversary, supposedly broken by years of heavy aerial bombardment, possessed the phenomenal capacity for such a massive synchronized uprising. This catastrophic failure of imagination guaranteed that the devastating initial blow would land with absolute maximum psychological and physical destruction across the entire country. Every ticking second brought the explosive, inevitable confrontation drastically closer to reality, while the oblivious capital city continued to joyfully celebrate. The meticulously planned logistics network had successfully delivered thousands of combatants directly into the heavily fortified centers of enemy political power. They hid silently in plain sight, blending flawlessly into the chaotic, festive background, like dangerous, venomous snakes coiled tightly in the colorful, vibrant grass. The absolute sheer audacity of this unprecedented military maneuver would soon rewrite the fundamental global principles of modern asymmetric warfare for countless future generations to rigorously study. A lone American sentry guarding a critical ammunition depot paused momentarily to light a damp cigarette in the dense tropical humidity. He exhaled a long plume of gray smoke, tiredly whispering to the silent night that he desperately missed his lovely wife back in Texas. At that precise, tragic moment, an elite sapper silently slipped through the outer perimeter wire just 20 yards away from the unsuspecting, lonely soldier. The delicate, fragile membrane between absolute peaceful tranquility and horrific, unprecedented bloodshed was rapidly tearing apart under the immense, crushing weight of impending history. As the midnight hour finally descended upon the sprawling, dark city, the illusory, comforting silence was abruptly shattered once and for all. The seemingly impenetrable American military intelligence apparatus had ultimately failed to foresee the spectacular magnitude of this brilliant tactical masterstroke. The terrifying, relentless storm that commanders foolishly believed had passed was actually just beginning to violently unleash its unprecedented, devastating fury upon them. A newly born, chaotic chapter of the gruesomely complex Vietnam War was suddenly violently ripped open, forever changing the tragic, immediate destinies of millions of innocent, ordinary people. In the dead of night on January 31st, the festive sounds of firecrackers in Saigon suddenly morphed into the terrifying staccato of automatic gunfire. The fortress considered the safest place in Vietnam was breached not by an army, but by a handful of shadows. A specialized Viet Cong sapper team, consisting of merely 19 highly trained commandos, approached the imposing walls of the United States Embassy. They navigated the empty streets in a small convoy of innocent-looking vehicles, carrying lethal explosives and an absolute determination to strike at the very heart of American diplomatic power. The sleeping capital awoke to a deafening roar as a massive satchel charge blasted a gaping hole right through the reinforced concrete perimeter of the embassy compound. As the first explosive shattered the embassy wall, the illusion of American control in Vietnam shattered along with it. Dust and thick black smoke violently swallowed the pristine courtyard, while the commandos poured through the newly created breach. 2 American military policemen guarding the night entrance were instantly killed in the initial barrage, their sudden deaths marking the grim beginning of an incredibly chaotic and bloody siege. Inside the heavily fortified main chancery building, a handful of Marine guards desperately scrambled to secure the heavy teak doors against the incoming furious assault. They fired their weapons blindly into the dark, smoke-filled courtyard, frantically radioing for immediate military reinforcements that would not arrive for several agonizing hours. The attackers, armed with rocket-propelled grenades, the symbolic epicenter of Western political influence, had instantly become a desperate battleground of survival for the trapped and terrified personnel. Across the sprawling city at the heavily guarded military headquarters, General Westmoreland was abruptly jolted from his sleep by the continuous distant explosions echoing through the muggy air. Initial frantic reports flooding into the operations center were confusing, contradictory, and entirely unbelievable to the seasoned commanders on duty. A panicked staff officer hurriedly handed the general a fragmented dispatch detailing a direct assault on the sovereign embassy grounds. The Supreme Commander angrily dismissed the initial assessment, firmly stating that a ragtag group of desperate guerrillas could never successfully penetrate such a heavily defended urban stronghold. However, the embassy was far from the only critical target burning in the dark early hours of the new lunar year. Just a few blocks away, another heavily armed commando unit aggressively stormed the heavily fortified gates of the magnificent presidential palace. The attackers initiated their bold assault with a devastating barrage of anti-tank rockets, instantly destroying the primary defensive guard posts. South Vietnamese security forces, completely caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the sudden ambush, desperately returned fire from their entrenched positions behind the beautifully sculpted gardens and towering iron fences. Simultaneously, a separate elite squad of determined fighters violently breached the heavily secured compound of the National Broadcasting Network. Their primary strategic objective was to capture the main transmission tower and broadcast a pre-recorded revolutionary message declaring a nationwide general uprising to the masses. The terrified civilian technicians were swiftly held at gunpoint while the commandos frantically attempted to seize absolute control of the complex broadcasting equipment. A quick-thinking station manager secretly ordered an engineer to immediately cut the main power lines to the transmission tower, effectively neutralizing the enemy's incredibly crucial psychological warfare tool. American military police units, roaming the chaotic streets, suddenly found themselves engaged in brutal, point-blank urban combat with an enemy they could barely see in the darkness. Young soldiers who had spent their entire deployment directing traffic or guarding quiet warehouses were unexpectedly fighting for their lives against battle-hardened guerrilla veterans. Frantic radio calls for medical evacuation and heavily armored backup jammed the localized frequencies, creating a deafening symphony of absolute operational panic. The meticulously planned infiltration had successfully transformed the supposedly secure rear echelon into a deadly, unpredictable front line filled with invisible, highly lethal threats. The devastating shockwave of the midnight offensive extended far beyond the burning avenues of the besieged capital city. From the dense Mekong Delta in the south to the mountainous Central Highlands, over 100 different provincial capitals, military installations, and strategic towns were struck almost simultaneously. The unprecedented scale of this highly coordinated nationwide assault completely overwhelmed the incredibly fragile South Vietnamese defensive infrastructure. Sleepy regional outposts were violently overrun by swarms of determined attackers, leaving isolated Allied garrisons entirely cut off from any immediate tactical support or desperately needed critical supply chains. Massive Allied air bases, which housed billions of dollars worth of advanced military aviation technology, quickly became prime targets for devastating enemy mortar and rocket barrages. At the sprawling Tan Son Nhut Air Base, explosive projectiles rained down relentlessly upon the unprotected concrete flight lines, destroying dozens of parked helicopters and crucial fighter jets. Panic mechanics and flight crews grabbed whatever small arms they could find, desperately attempting to defend the vital perimeter against waves of advancing infantry. The undisputed aerial supremacy of the United States military was temporarily grounded by the relentless, terrifying rain of explosive steel. Western journalists resting in their downtown Saigon hotel rooms were violently awakened by the relentless concussive blasts rattling their fragile glass windows. Experienced war correspondents grabbed their heavy cameras and hastily strapped on protective helmets, sprinting recklessly toward the raging sounds of intense urban combat. They instinctively recognized that the spectacular unfolding violence was a massively significant historical event that would instantly shatter the optimistic official narratives constantly fed to the American public. The blinding flashes of explosive ordnance brilliantly illuminated their terrified faces as they frantically documented the unimaginable bloody chaos erupting right outside their doors. In the narrow, winding alleys of a densely populated Saigon neighborhood, a fierce firefight erupted between a trapped American patrol and a well-entrenched sniper squad. The young American lieutenant frantically shouted commands over the deafening roar of automatic weapons, desperately trying to organize a coordinated defensive perimeter. He screamed into his heavy field radio that his unit was taking heavy casualties and required immediate artillery support to suppress the unseen enemy positions. The once vibrant civilian market stalls were instantly transformed into temporary bloody triage centers for the critically wounded, moaning soldiers bleeding on the pavement. The revolutionary fighters executing this incredibly audacious assault operated with a chilling, absolute acceptance of their own inevitable mortality. They had been strictly instructed by their commanding officers that their primary mission was to create maximum psychological disruption, regardless of the horrific personal cost. A wounded sapper lying bleeding on the embassy lawn tightly gripped his weapon, refusing to surrender even as heavily armed military police slowly advanced upon his position. This unwavering fanatical dedication to their political cause terrified the young American draftees, who simply could not comprehend such an extreme willingness to embrace certain death. As the dark hours slowly crept toward the impending dawn, the desperate situation inside the American embassy compound remained incredibly volatile and dangerously unresolved. A team of airborne reinforcements finally arrived in a roaring helicopter, attempting a daring tactical landing on the reinforced roof of the main chancery building. However, intense enemy ground fire violently repelled the approaching aircraft, forcing the desperate pilot to quickly abort the crucial rescue mission. The trapped diplomats and frightened military personnel huddled anxiously inside the dark, smoke-filled corridors, wondering if they would actually survive to see the morning sun rise. Back at the military command center, the grim reality of the catastrophic nationwide situation was finally beginning to penetrate the dense walls of institutional denial. General Westmoreland stared intently at the rapidly updating strategic map, watching as hundreds of red hostile indicators continuously illuminated across the entire country. He slowly realized that the massive artillery siege at Khe Sanh had been a brilliant, spectacular diversion designed to pull his elite combat forces away from the vulnerable urban centers. The painful, humiliating truth was that the supposedly defeated enemy had just successfully executed a flawless strategic masterpiece. Terrified civilian residents of Saigon barricaded their fragile wooden doors and hid underneath their heavy beds, silently praying for the terrifying violence to somehow stop. The festive holiday foods lovingly prepared for the joyous family gatherings were completely forgotten as the deafening sounds of warfare relentlessly pounded against their trembling walls. A frightened mother tightly covered her young child's ears, desperately whispering comforting promises that the brave soldiers would soon restore peace to their burning neighborhood. The cultural sanctity of the beloved Tet Festival had been utterly desecrated by the tragic, unforgiving brutality of modern ideological warfare. When the first pale rays of morning light finally broke through the thick black smoke, the true horrific extent of the embassy battle became chillingly visible. Heavily armed American paratroopers systematically breached the damaged compound gates, engaging the few remaining exhausted commandos in brutal, close-quarters room-to-room combat. The pristine diplomatic lawns were heavily cratered by violent explosions and tragically littered with the bloodied corpses of both the brave defenders and the determined revolutionary attackers. A battered American flag still defiantly waved above the ruined structure, but the powerful aura of absolute invincibility was permanently, irreversibly destroyed. Simultaneously, South Vietnamese armored units ruthlessly crushed the remaining enemy resistance surrounding the heavily contested national radio broadcasting station. The desperate revolutionary fighters, realizing their critical mission to broadcast the uprising had completely failed, stubbornly fought to the bitter end rather than surrender to the advancing troops. Heavy tank rounds mercilessly slammed into the concrete building, violently ending the intense standoff and leaving the crucial communication facility in absolute blazing ruins. The immediate tactical victory belonged to the Allied forces, but the deeply terrifying psychological impact of the bold assault had already been successfully delivered worldwide. Press photographers rapidly swarmed the secured embassy compound, frantically capturing iconic, shocking images that would soon dominate international newspaper headlines across the globe. They photographed the lifeless bodies of the young Viet Cong fighters lying motionless next to the heavy, shattered, decorative flower pots they had used for concealment. The stark, disturbing visual contrast between the peaceful diplomatic architecture and the gruesome reality of sudden violent death created a profound, unforgettable cinematic narrative. These raw, unedited photographs would fundamentally challenge everything the American public had been repeatedly told about the supposedly undeniable progress of the war. As the confusing morning progressed, horrifying reports of massive casualties and widespread catastrophic structural damage continued pouring into the overwhelmed Central Intelligence Headquarters. It became terrifyingly clear that the sudden synchronized assaults were not just isolated, desperate terrorist incidents, but rather a highly sophisticated, unified military campaign. Entire provincial capitals remained firmly under the absolute control of deeply entrenched communist forces, requiring massive, destructive counteroffensives to eventually reclaim the lost urban territory. The Allied military machine, specifically designed for massive jungle warfare, found itself awkwardly struggling to efficiently eradicate a deeply embedded enemy from densely populated cities. In a controversial, highly publicized morning press briefing held directly amidst the smoking ruins of the embassy compound, General Westmoreland attempted to project calm authority. He confidently declared to the skeptical gathered journalists that the enemy offensive was a complete tactical failure and that all major strategic installations were secure. A seasoned reporter boldly interrupted the general, loudly questioning how a supposedly defeated, starving insurgent army could successfully blow a massive hole in the sovereign American embassy. The general's rigid, dismissive response only further fueled the rapidly growing media skepticism regarding the actual competence of the military leadership. The psychological toll on the young American soldiers who survived that incredibly terrifying first night of the coordinated offensive was completely immeasurable and deeply profound. They suddenly realized that absolutely nowhere in the entire divided country was truly safe from the sudden, explosive wrath of the determined unseen enemy. The comfortable, heavily fortified rear echelon bases they had previously considered secure sanctuaries were now permanently transformed into potential, highly volatile combat zones filled with invisible lethal threats. This terrifying fundamental paradigm shift abruptly destroyed their fragile morale, replacing their naive confidence with a permanent, exhausting state of hypervigilant paranoia. Within the first 24 hours of the unprecedented nationwide surprise attack, thousands of lives had been violently extinguished in the chaotic, burning city streets. The meticulously planned revolutionary masterstroke had successfully exposed the glaring, catastrophic vulnerabilities of the massively funded American military occupation to the entire watching world. The bold guerrilla fighters had paid an incredibly horrific price in human blood, with nearly all of the elite initial strike teams being completely wiped out by superior Allied firepower. However, their ultimate primary objective to permanently shock the rigid foundation of the American political establishment was a spectacular success. While the intense fires in Saigon were slowly being systematically extinguished by heavily armed response units, a much darker, longer nightmare was simultaneously beginning up north. The majestic, ancient imperial capital city, located near the heavily fortified, demilitarized zone, had completely fallen into the firm hands of heavily armed communist regiments. Unlike the rapid, suicidal hit-and-run commando raids in the southern capital, this northern city was actively preparing for a massive, protracted, and incredibly bloody urban siege. The sudden midnight shockwave had violently initiated a terrifying new phase of the war, and the worst slaughter was yet to come. The dense tropical sun eventually climbed high into the smoke-filled sky, illuminating a completely transformed, deeply scarred nation still reeling from the explosive midnight terror. The deeply ingrained comforting illusion of a swiftly approaching military victory had been violently, permanently incinerated within a few hours of relentless, coordinated, bloody chaos. The exhausted Allied commanders now faced the daunting, monumental task of systematically retaking dozens of fiercely contested, burning urban centers from a deeply entrenched, highly motivated enemy force. The devastating historical reverberations of this single bloody night would continuously echo violently throughout the remaining tragic years of the controversial conflict. Located on the misty banks of the Perfume River, the ancient imperial city of Hue had long been considered a tranquil cultural sanctuary. For generations, its revered temples and quiet cobblestone streets remained largely untouched by the escalating violence consuming the southern provinces. Both sides traditionally respected the historical significance of the former royal capital, treating it as a fragile museum of national identity. However, this unspoken agreement was violently shattered as heavily armed revolutionary battalions quietly crossed the dark river. Ancient walls that had survived centuries of dynasties were about to face the relentless fury of modern artillery. In the misty, freezing darkness of the early morning, thousands of disciplined communist troops systematically infiltrated the sleeping city from multiple directions. They swiftly overwhelmed the lightly defended regional outposts, quickly raising their distinctive revolutionary flag high above the iconic Citadel Tower. Most of the local civilian population awoke to find their beloved historic neighborhoods already firmly under the absolute control of the determined guerrilla forces. The sheer speed and meticulous precision of this massive urban occupation completely paralyzed the scattered South Vietnamese defensive units, who were caught entirely off guard during the sacred holiday ceasefire. Stationed just a few miles outside the city limits, young American Marines received frantic emergency orders to immediately reclaim the captured provincial capital. These combat-hardened soldiers were extensively trained for dense jungle warfare, heavily relying on massive airstrikes and superior artillery support to destroy unseen enemies. They possessed absolutely no practical experience in the deadly, complex art of close-quarters urban combat amidst tightly packed civilian neighborhoods. As they loaded onto their green transport trucks in the freezing drizzle, a grizzled sergeant nervously reminded his anxious squad that fighting inside a city was a completely different kind of hell. The advancing Marine convoys confidently approached the southern bridges, foolishly expecting a swift and decisive victory against a disorganized insurgent force. Instead, they were violently met with a devastating wall of concentrated machine gun fire pouring down from the elevated concrete rooftops. The entrenched communist fighters had heavily fortified every intersection, utilizing the thick stone walls of the ancient structures as impenetrable defensive bunkers. For the young Marines, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, turning every window into a sniper's nest and every alley into a tomb. The horrific bloodbath of the Hue City siege had officially begun. Progress was agonizingly measured not by miles or even city blocks, but by brutally clearing individual rooms and shattered residential courtyards. The terrified American troops were forced to blast massive holes through thick interior walls to advance, desperately avoiding the lethal streets heavily covered by hidden snipers. Grenades were blindly tossed into dark, smoke-filled living rooms before nervous soldiers frantically rushed inside with their bayonets fixed. The once beautiful civilian homes were instantly transformed into nightmarish, claustrophobic slaughterhouses where survival depended entirely on split-second reflexes and absolute brutal aggression. The deafening noise of constant explosions was physically agonizing. To make the miserable situation even worse, a thick, freezing gray monsoon mist continuously blanketed the burning city throughout the early weeks of February. This terrible weather completely grounded the powerful American tactical aircraft, depriving the struggling Marines of their most decisive and lethal military advantage. Without the critical ability to call in massive protective airstrikes, the exhausted infantrymen were forced to rely solely on their handheld weapons and limited tank support. The cold, relentless rain soaked through their heavy combat gear, chilling the terrified young men to the bone as they shivered in the muddy, blood-stained ruins. Caught entirely in the crossfire of this unprecedented urban devastation, thousands of terrified civilian residents desperately sought shelter in the dark, cramped basements. Families huddled together in absolute terror, listening to the deafening roar of heavy artillery shells mercilessly pounding the fragile roofs above their heads. Food and clean water supplies were completely exhausted within days, forcing brave individuals to risk their lives dodging sniper fire just to scavenge for basic survival necessities. The absolute climax of the grueling month-long battle centered directly upon the massive, imposing stone walls of the historic imperial citadel. This sprawling fortress, surrounded by a deep moat and thick defensive barriers, provided the entrenched revolutionary fighters with a nearly impregnable military position. American commanders reluctantly authorized the extensive use of heavy naval artillery and devastating tear gas to aggressively dislodge the stubborn defenders from their ancient strongholds. The magnificent, culturally priceless architecture of the royal palaces was systematically pulverized into absolute dust, sacrificed completely on the altar of immediate military necessity and desperate tactical survival. Sitting exhausted behind a crumbling brick wall, a young medic frantically bandaged the bleeding leg of a sobbing teenage Marine. The terrified boy desperately clutched the medic's arm, crying out that he just wanted to go home and see his mother again before he died. The older medic firmly pushed the soldier down, sternly ordering him to stay absolutely quiet and focus purely on breathing through the overwhelming pain. These intensely intimate moments of extreme vulnerability and raw human terror were constantly repeated throughout the ruined city, deeply scarring the psychological foundations of every single survivor. While the brutal military engagement raged across the southern districts, a deeply sinister political purge was simultaneously unfolding within the captured northern sectors. Hardline revolutionary commissars systematically executed thousands of local government officials, policemen, and innocent Catholic priests who were officially deemed dangerous enemies of the state. These targeted victims were tragically marched into the dense surrounding forests, brutally shot, and unceremoniously buried in massive hidden mass graves. This terrifying, organized political violence added a profoundly dark and unforgiving layer of absolute moral tragedy to an already catastrophic and deeply traumatic urban military conflict. By the final week of February, the overwhelmingly superior firepower of the Allied forces finally began to systematically break the back of the communist resistance. Exhausted, starving, and critically low on essential ammunition, the surviving revolutionary battalions received strategic orders to slowly initiate a tactical retreat into the western mountains. They silently slipped away under the protective cover of the freezing midnight fog, leaving behind a completely unrecognizable landscape of absolute apocalyptic devastation. The young American Marines cautiously advanced through the eerily quiet, heavily cratered streets, completely physically and mentally drained by the horrific, unimaginable urban slaughter. When the bright yellow South Vietnamese flag was finally raised again above the battered citadel, there was absolutely no joyful celebration among the surviving exhausted troops. They stared blankly at the smoking, pulverized ruins of what was once considered the most beautiful and culturally significant city in the entire divided nation. The historic Battle of Hue technically ended as an Allied military victory, but the profound physical destruction and massive loss of innocent human life felt like a devastating absolute defeat. The horrifying, lingering ghosts of this ancient shattered capital would haunt the American collective conscience forever, half a world away from the smoldering ruins of Hue and the blood-stained streets of Saigon. A completely different kind of battleground was rapidly taking shape. The battles were fought in the streets of Vietnam, but the war was being lost in the living rooms of America. Millions of ordinary citizens sat comfortably on their soft couches, staring intensely at the flickering glow of their modern television sets. The unprecedented, horrific violence of the distant military conflict was suddenly being broadcast directly into the peaceful sanctuaries of their quiet, perfectly manicured suburban homes. For several agonizing years, the American public had been repeatedly assured by their top political leaders that the communist insurgency was on the verge of total collapse. Official military briefings constantly highlighted favorable enemy body counts and promised that a glorious final victory was just around the corner. The shocking, unedited television footage of heavily armed guerrillas aggressively storming the sovereign United States Embassy instantly shattered that carefully constructed narrative forever. The immense psychological shockwave violently ripped through the deeply divided nation, completely destroying any remaining public trust in the rigid governmental establishment. Seeking to uncover the undeniable truth behind the massively conflicting official reports, legendary broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite immediately decided to travel directly to the burning war zone. Known affectionately by millions of viewers as the most trusted man in America, his deeply respected opinions carried immense, unprecedented political weight. He bravely walked through the chaotic, heavily cratered streets of Hue, wearing a heavy flak jacket and speaking directly with the exhausted, terrified young Marines. The grim, brutal reality of the absolute urban devastation he witnessed fundamentally changed his entire personal perspective on the conflict. The aggressive proliferation of modern portable video cameras allowed brave combat journalists to capture the terrifying, visceral horror of the ongoing offensive with unprecedented, shocking clarity. Evening news broadcasts prominently featured deeply disturbing images of dead American soldiers being hastily loaded onto medical evacuation helicopters under heavy enemy fire. Families sitting down for their quiet evening meals were suddenly forced to watch the agonizing, bloody reality of their young sons bleeding out in the muddy tropical jungles. The psychological distance between the safe American home front and the brutal foreign battlefield was permanently erased. One particularly horrific, unforgettable photograph captured during the chaotic early days of the offensive perfectly encapsulated the absolute brutal, unforgiving nature of the ongoing ideological struggle. An award-winning photojournalist bravely documented the exact chilling moment a South Vietnamese police chief casually executed a captured revolutionary fighter directly in the middle of a crowded Saigon street. This incredibly graphic, deeply disturbing image was instantly printed on the front pages of countless major international newspapers across the entire globe. The sheer casual brutality of the summary execution completely horrified the increasingly skeptical American public watching from afar. Inside the heavily guarded walls of the White House, President Lyndon B. Johnson anxiously paced the floors of the Oval Office late into the sleepless night. He felt completely trapped by the rapidly deteriorating military situation, constantly receiving frantic, highly contradictory intelligence briefings from his increasingly desperate top military advisors. General Westmoreland aggressively demanded hundreds of thousands of additional combat troops to supposedly crush the weakened enemy once and for all. However, the deeply exhausted president realized that escalating the highly unpopular war would absolutely destroy his rapidly crumbling domestic political legacy forever. The massive financial burden of desperately maintaining the rapidly expanding military occupation was systematically draining the vital economic resources of the entire United States. Crucial domestic social programs originally designed to completely eradicate poverty and deeply rooted racial inequality were suddenly stripped of their much-needed federal funding. Widespread, increasingly violent anti-war protests aggressively erupted across countless prestigious university campuses, violently tearing the fragile social fabric of the divided nation entirely apart. The profound, terrifying realization that the massive military superpower could not easily defeat a determined peasant army caused an unprecedented national existential crisis. On the historic evening of February 27th, millions of anxious Americans tuned in to watch Walter Cronkite deliver his highly anticipated special television report. Looking directly into the camera lens with absolute solemn authority, the respected journalist firmly declared that the bloody conflict was hopelessly mired in a violent stalemate. He explicitly suggested that the only rational way out would be to peacefully negotiate as an honorable people who had fulfilled their pledge. When the most trusted man in America declared the war a stalemate, the president knew the heart of the nation had flatlined. President Johnson reportedly watched the incredibly damaging broadcast from within his private quarters, heavily burdened by the immense, crushing weight of the rapidly escalating national tragedy. He turned to his closest political aides and quietly muttered that if he had truly lost the support of Cronkite, he had absolutely lost the support of Middle America. The fierce political consensus that had previously maintained the massive military intervention was now completely, irreversibly shattered beyond any possible repair. The seemingly endless supply of unwavering patriotic optimism had finally been utterly exhausted by the relentless, horrifying images of seemingly pointless urban slaughter. Despite the profoundly catastrophic shift in public opinion, the top American military commanders stubbornly refused to publicly acknowledge the harsh, undeniable strategic reality of the situation. General Westmoreland formally submitted a highly controversial request for an additional 200,000 combat troops to launch a massive, decisive counteroffensive against the weakened enemy. However, the rapidly collapsing political administration in Washington could no longer successfully justify sending thousands more young draftees into the terrifying, deadly meat grinder of the Vietnamese jungles. The massive troop request was ultimately leaked to the aggressive press, further igniting absolute massive public outrage worldwide. The revolutionary leadership in Hanoi closely monitored the escalating political chaos violently erupting across the deeply divided American home front with immense strategic satisfaction. They fully understood that they had suffered incredibly catastrophic military casualties during the sudden nationwide uprising, losing tens of thousands of highly experienced, dedicated guerrilla fighters. However, they had successfully achieved their ultimate primary objective of completely breaking the unyielding political will of the massive occupying superpower through sheer unprecedented psychological terror. The brilliant asymmetric warfare strategy proved that massive bombs and advanced technology could never successfully defeat a highly motivated, politically united population. On the final day of March, President Johnson abruptly appeared on national television to deliver one of the most stunning, completely unexpected political speeches in American history. He formally announced a partial halt to the devastating aerial bombardment of North Vietnam and desperately called for immediate peace negotiations to finally end the agonizing bloodshed. In a deeply emotional, completely unprecedented final statement, he explicitly declared that he would absolutely not seek or accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. The immensely powerful leader had been permanently defeated by the terrifying ghosts of the Tet Offensive. The deeply traumatized American society would never again view their government or their massive military establishment with the same unwavering, innocent level of absolute, unquestioning trust. The incredibly disturbing, highly graphic television broadcasts had permanently exposed the massive, undeniable gap between the optimistic official political rhetoric and the horrifying, bloody battlefield reality. The devastating offensive ultimately proved that the incredibly complex ideological conflict could never be successfully won purely through overwhelming military force or massive technological superiority. The painful, lingering psychological wounds inflicted upon the divided nation during those chaotic winter months would continue bleeding heavily for decades. Across major cities, massive crowds of angry, disillusioned college students aggressively poured into the public streets to vigorously protest the increasingly senseless continuation of the deadly military draft. They burned their official conscription cards in roaring bonfires and violently clashed with heavily armed riot police stationed outside vital government administrative buildings. The passionate, deeply organized anti-war movement suddenly gained millions of new mainstream supporters who had previously remained quietly supportive of the government's aggressive foreign policy. The shocking television footage from the burning overseas battlefields had successfully catalyzed a massive, unprecedented cultural revolution right within the United States. The immense, crushing political pressure finally forced the stubborn American leadership to completely abandon their unrealistic dreams of achieving an absolute, unconditional military victory in Southeast Asia. The intense, bloody battles slowly began to significantly subside across the battered urban centers of South Vietnam, but the devastating strategic damage had already been permanently inflicted. The revolutionary forces had successfully completely shattered the fragile American resolve, proving that the psychological dimension of modern warfare was far more crucial than sheer firepower. The incredibly long, agonizingly slow process of the inevitable American withdrawal was now absolutely, fundamentally unavoidable for everyone involved. As the sweltering heat of the late tropical spring finally descended upon the fractured nation, the thick, suffocating smoke slowly began to clear from the devastated urban landscapes. The once vibrant capital of Saigon and the historically revered imperial city of Hue lay heavily scarred by the unimaginable ferocity of the unprecedented nationwide offensive. Exhausted citizens slowly emerged from the dark, cramped basements to tragically survey the absolute apocalyptic ruin of their beloved ancestral neighborhoods. The terrifying midnight shockwave had finally passed, leaving behind a deeply traumatized society completely unrecognizable from just a few agonizing months prior. The deeply entrenched revolutionary forces had paid an incredibly horrific physical price for their spectacular, massively coordinated military gamble across the southern provinces. Tens of thousands of highly experienced, fiercely dedicated guerrilla fighters had been systematically wiped out by the overwhelmingly superior, devastating Allied firepower during the intense urban combat operations. Elite commandos and veteran local organizers were entirely decimated, leaving the underground communist infrastructure heavily crippled and struggling desperately to effectively reorganize its shattered ranks. However, the true historical significance of this unprecedented assault extended far beyond the immediate, bloody battlefield casualties measured by the military commanders. In the brutal arithmetic of war, one side lost thousands of men, while the other lost its will to fight entirely. The Allied forces had technically successfully defended all major strategic installations and systematically reclaimed every single contested urban center after weeks of grueling, intense urban combat. From a strictly conventional military perspective, General Westmoreland firmly believed he had achieved a massive, undeniable tactical victory against a desperate, fundamentally weakened insurgent army. Yet this hollow, bloody triumph ironically marked the absolute undeniable beginning of the ultimate, humiliating strategic defeat for the massively funded American military occupation in Vietnam. President Johnson's shocking, unprecedented television announcement to completely abandon his re-election campaign sent massive political shockwaves reverberating violently throughout the entire global geopolitical landscape. The incredibly powerful American commander-in-chief had effectively surrendered his prestigious political career to the terrifying, lingering ghosts of the chaotic, bloody Tet Offensive. His unexpected departure forcefully slammed the heavy door on the disastrous era of continuous military escalation, immediately paving the highly controversial way for the incredibly complex diplomatic peace negotiations. The rigid foundation of the massive American political establishment was permanently fractured by the agonizing psychological trauma inflicted during those dark winter months. Shortly after the president's stunning resignation announcement, the controversial military leadership in Vietnam also underwent a massive, deeply symbolic, fundamental transformation. General Westmoreland was quietly removed from his supreme command position and officially reassigned back to Washington, effectively ending his incredibly aggressive strategy of relying entirely upon massive enemy body counts. The new military administration quickly realized that sheer, overwhelming technological firepower could never successfully completely crush a deeply rooted, politically motivated national liberation movement. The flawed, arrogant strategic paradigm that had initially guided the massive American intervention was finally, permanently dismantled by the harsh, undeniable reality of the offensive. For the fragile South Vietnamese government, the devastating nationwide surprise attacks permanently exposed their glaring, catastrophic inability to adequately protect their own civilian population. Despite fighting bravely to successfully repel the massive coordinated assaults, the tragic, undeniable reality was that the massive insurgent infiltration had completely bypassed their massive defensive networks. The heavily shaken local political leaders suddenly realized they could no longer eternally rely upon the seemingly invincible American military shield for their absolute national survival. A deep, unsettling wave of extreme paranoia and profound political instability violently swept through the heavily guarded halls of the presidential palace. The massive, profoundly damaging psychological impact of the unprecedented urban bloodshed directly accelerated the highly controversial strategic transition officially known as Vietnamization. American policymakers desperately sought a convenient, politically acceptable exit strategy, aiming to rapidly shift the heavy, agonizing burden of active frontline combat directly onto the South Vietnamese armed forces. This incredibly complex, highly rushed military transition was born not out of genuine strategic confidence, but rather from absolute domestic political desperation to stop the massive American casualties. The incredibly wealthy superpower was systematically preparing to slowly abandon a highly destructive conflict it could no longer successfully control. The aggressive, independent journalism that courageously documented the absolute terrifying reality of the massive urban combat forever changed the fundamental relationship between the government and the free press. The highly graphic, completely uncensored television broadcasts from the burning streets of Saigon permanently shattered the deeply ingrained public tendency to blindly trust official military pronouncements. The incredibly stark, deeply disturbing visual contrast between the optimistic official political rhetoric and the agonizing bloody battlefield reality created a massive, insurmountable credibility gap. This profound, lingering skepticism toward governmental authority would violently shape the entire American cultural landscape for many future generations. Meanwhile, the deeply traumatized civilian survivors living amidst the pulverized, smoking ruins of the ancient imperial city of Hue began the agonizingly slow process of rebuilding their completely shattered lives. They mournfully searched through the massive, unstable piles of shattered concrete, desperately attempting to recover the decaying bodies of their tragically executed innocent relatives. The terrifying, deeply disturbing discovery of numerous hidden mass graves containing thousands of brutally murdered civilians added a profoundly dark, unforgiving layer of absolute moral horror. The majestic city had tragically become a permanent, haunting monument to the absolute ultimate cruelty of modern ideological warfare. The shocking, unprecedented events of the massive coordinated offensive also resonated violently across the entire divided geopolitical landscape of the incredibly tense Cold War era. International allies who had previously quietly supported the massive American military intervention suddenly began to publicly question the ultimate strategic wisdom of the devastating, seemingly endless conflict. The powerful, highly motivated communist leadership in Hanoi had successfully utilized a seemingly disastrous military defeat to ultimately achieve an absolutely spectacular, massive global psychological victory. They brilliantly proved that unyielding political endurance could successfully overcome the most advanced, massively funded military machine in human history. As thousands of exhausted, deeply traumatized young American veterans slowly returned to their deeply divided domestic home front, they were tragically met with unprecedented, massive public hostility and profound indifference. The deeply passionate, highly organized anti-war movement continued to aggressively completely disrupt the normal functions of the massive government, demanding an immediate, total withdrawal of all combat troops. The absolute terrifying memories of the chaotic, blood-soaked urban battles fundamentally altered the entire collective psyche of the rapidly changing, deeply fractured American nation. The massive, undeniable tragedy of the controversial war permanently stained the entire historical legacy of a generation. The historic, profoundly consequential military campaign fundamentally transformed the entire agonizing trajectory of the deeply controversial conflict in ways nobody could have ever successfully predicted. The incredibly destructive, Massively coordinated surprise attacks effectively destroyed the deeply rooted American illusion of an absolute, swift, and highly decisive military victory in Southeast Asia. The violent, unforgiving storms of the massive Lunar New Year offensive had finally passed, leaving behind a heavily scarred, completely permanently altered global political landscape. The guns of Tet eventually fell silent, but their echoes would dictate the fate of a nation for another 7 years. Ultimately, the absolute unprecedented ferocity of the terrifying midnight shockwave serves as a deeply profound, eternally haunting historical reminder of the immense, catastrophic limitations of sheer military power. The incredibly brilliant, highly coordinated asymmetric warfare strategy completely dismantled the massively funded, overwhelmingly powerful Allied defense networks through absolute sheer psychological terror and unimaginable human sacrifice. The deeply tragic, profoundly disturbing lessons fiercely etched into the burning streets of those battered cities remain completely incredibly relevant to modern military strategists worldwide. History will forever remember 1968 as the agonizing year the unshakable American empire violently collided with absolute reality. The staggering, absolutely unprecedented financial costs associated with systematically rebuilding the heavily devastated urban infrastructure heavily crippled the struggling South Vietnamese wartime economy. Massive inflation rapidly destroyed the basic purchasing power of ordinary citizens, plunging thousands of heavily traumatized civilian families into an incredibly deep, inescapable cycle of absolute terrible poverty. The massive influx of desperate, homeless refugees flooding into the overcrowded capital city created a severe, absolutely unprecedented humanitarian crisis that the fragile government simply could not successfully manage. The deeply tragic economic fallout of the brutal military campaign would ruthlessly continue punishing the civilian population for decades. The incredibly brave, highly determined combatants on both sides of the deeply controversial conflict had completely exhausted their absolute emotional breaking points during those fiery weeks. Young American draftees and deeply devoted revolutionary fighters alike had violently shed their precious blood onto the exact same shattered concrete, forever bound together by the terrifying intimacy of brutal urban warfare. The massive, undeniable historical magnitude of their shared, profound suffering completely transcends the incredibly rigid, highly polarizing political ideologies that violently forced them into such a deadly confrontation. The true, absolute cost of the controversial war was finally completely fully revealed.